What's up, people, and welcome to another episode of the I Am Conquering Mountains podcast. Have a wonderful, and inspiring guest joining the podcast today. This is an individual who has conquered many mountains herself. She is a member of the House of Delegates, has been since 2019 of the state of Maryland, member of the Appropriations Committee. She is also a member of the Oversight Committee, member of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, Women Legislators of Maryland, Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus, and a member of the Maryland Sexual Assault Evidence Kit Policy and Funding Committee. She is a graduate of Coppin State University with a Bachelor's of Science degree, and she is an attorney receiving her Juris Doctorate from the University of Baltimore School of Law. She is also a member of Anne Arundel County Bar Association, member of the Young Women's Christian Association, a recipient of the Sojourner Truth Award of Anne Arundel County in 2021. And she is an example of what it means and inspiring women to crack the glass ceiling. And I want to welcome and introduce you all to Miss Shaneka Henson.
Thank you, Charles, for the warm welcome to the podcast. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
Hope you got to celebrate a great deal last night. And
I sure did.
One thing I do appreciate about you and love about you and things that I've heard is that you're not afraid to crack that glass ceiling. You know, there's some ideals about or what society says women should be doing as far as being a wife and a mother, especially Black women. But you are inspiring women and young girls that they can have both, a career as well as a successful family as well, too. So I definitely commend you and greatly appreciate you for that. So my first question in regards to cracking that glass ceiling is, does your family often look at you in awe? Like, how can you're doing all of these wonderful things for the community, as well as being a mother and a wife as well. So does your family often like, hey, how is she still doing all of this stuff?
Thank you. And thank you for the acknowledgement of the intersectionality of being Black and being woman and being in these spaces that I am so privileged and honored to hold and to be able to navigate, being an attorney, being in the House of Delegates, all these different awesome responsibilities. When it comes to family, I smiled instantly when you said that, because my son, who was there celebrating with me last night, is 18 years old, and he's headed off to college himself. And I had him when I was in college. And so now it's so amazing to see him at the age that I was when I became his mother. And He is just starting to get to an awareness and an appreciation of the road that I've traveled, because he's seen the entire journey. He was there before I graduated college. He was there when I was in law school, when I was first elected to public office. He has been in the passenger seat along the ride for every leg of this journey. And so for him, when you see the sausage being made, sometimes you can't appreciate the taste as much,
Right.
But he is starting to, as he matures into a young man and starts to understand the responsibilities that he has, I think he is getting a renewed appreciation for all the different things that I've done and pushed for, and not just settled for, but continue to push things forward throughout the course of his life. So I smile because I hope that he will use it as fuel and inspiration to understand that there are no boundaries that can hold him back, and that anything that he aspires to, he is 100% capable of. So I hope that for the family spectrum, that because they see so much of the hard work and the journey, that I hope and pray that really does let them know that possibilities are infinite.
Right. And that's great because, my wife and I, she's from Annapolis as well, too. And we have our daughter will be 2 next month. And we're often talking about how, we kind of want to set the tone for her and to be a great example, as her mother and as her father. We both have college degrees. My wife is working towards her master's. I have my master's. Eventually, I'll be going for my doctorate in education. And we want to make sure that we set that tone that she can also accomplish those things. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing, or have done the same thing for your son as well, too, now that he's going off into college to define his career. So that's a great point to make. And I'm glad you brought that up. So you're in the Maryland, you're a Maryland state delegate. And what district do you serve?
I represent District 30A. So I came to the delegate seat in 2019, as you mentioned. I was on the Annapolis City Council prior to that, and I was representing Ward 6. The city of Annapolis is drawn up into 8 different wards. Ward 6 had the distinction of having the highest concentration of public housing of all of the wards in the city of Annapolis. So I really got to understand very intimately the needs of people in the city that really were the most vulnerable. That was the terminology that we would use then to describe them. But in the pandemic, we called them all essential workers, right? Because when I was at the grocery store, all of my constituents from then, were the ones who could make sure that me and my family could find the bleach and find the things that people couldn't find. We still had direct access to, because my constituents, they didn't get to take a day off. They were still in nursing homes providing care. They were still doing those frontline food service worker jobs and doing those jobs that couldn't be done by telework like I got the luxury and privilege of doing. They were still nose to the grindstone. So I started off on the city council. I then, in 2019, our Speaker of the House, Mike Bush, he was our delegate as well. And so he passed, and they had to fill the vacancy in his seat. And I got appointed to the remainder of his delegate term. So my district went from a very small insular part of the city to all of 30A, which is the entirety of the city of Annapolis, plus the suburban area, which goes all the way through the Annapolis Neck Peninsula. And then it goes down to Edgewater, which can get pretty rural and southern. And it's a whole different, field in the city of Annapolis. They have their own culture there as well. And then up northern into the suburbs of Arundel as well. So 30A is pretty expansive and different from corner to corner.
What was the transition like going from Ward 6 to now almost, like, as you mentioned, like almost all or half of Anne Arundel County? Like, what was that transition like?
Ward 6, it really allowed me to be focused on the needs of a specific community, because there was so much commonality amongst the different communities in Ward 6. Of course, all of them were not public housing, but all of them were near to public housing. So even the residents that didn't live in income-based housing, they had a great concern for the quality of life for people who did, because they were their children's classmates. They were their neighbors. When things happened in those communities, the spillover into the neighboring communities, that connection was one. So I really got to have a more narrow focus when I was on the council. But going to the House of Delegates, the policy that we make, the votes we take, it impacts all 6 million people in the state of Maryland. The one vote that I had, I didn't have. And then my district became so big and complex. I am representing, farms that are in my district, representing suburban areas in my district. I have, some universities now in my district. I have, a whole different set of needs and a different landscape. So I really had to broaden my scope and my focus when it came to giving, a voice and the representation that people deserved.
Right. And you're from Annapolis, right? So what was it like growing up in Annapolis for you?
Annapolis, it's for me. So I had my birthday yesterday, so I'm officially 39.
Okay.
So when
39 and young.
39 and young, yes. When I looked at the last, generation and looking at my time in school in Annapolis and growing up here, I can definitely mark some of the very real changes, over time. When I was growing up and we went to school, we had very integrated school experiences. Kids from all across Annapolis were my classmates, We had all the different racial diversities that existed in Annapolis. We were all together in school. So if you were in a city that was majority white and you were, in a minority population, you definitely felt that, because that was represented when you went to school. The demographics of Annapolis have included much more foreign-born people live in Annapolis now. We have a burgeoning Latino population in Annapolis now. We have different demographics, but when you look at some of our institutions, we don't always have that diversity that's reflected. We have much more ways to self-segregate and to decide to, go to different corners and have these kind of very pocketed existences. So I definitely can see how I got the opportunity to learn and grow and influence and be influenced by all of the different things that Annapolis had to offer,
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, especially about like the segregation kind of still exists. So when I moved to Annapolis in 2011, I started working at Annapolis High School as a permanent substitute and then a student advocate, and also went to Hillsmere Elementary as a behavioral specialist. And I remember, like, especially during our equity meetings, there will always be this conversation about the hidden Annapolis. And I wonder if you've heard, or the hidden Annapolis or the other Annapolis. Have you ever heard that saying before? And if you can share what that means?
Yeah, it wasn't until I was an adult that I started to hear people say that. And I guess that for as long as there's been an Annapolis, there probably has been that, hidden Annapolis, whether we're talking about the foundation of Annapolis when, the native population that was here was driven from their land, or talking about when, the area was, settled and then people brought, people to work indentured and enslaved in Annapolis, and how that population had no voice and representation. Or then, going after emancipation and how the communities were intentionally very segregated at that time, so that people, were separated into this working class group of folks and then into a ruling class group of folks. And then how those legacies still carry over into today. Like, look at my constituents in Ward 6, who during the pandemic were very much on the front lines in those jobs and in those professions that serve everyone in such an essential way that they couldn't stay home to stay safe when the rest of us did have the ability to do that. So I think that the story of the tale of the two Annapolises is probably as foundational to the city as any part of its founding. And it's a really tough part of the city's legacy that I fight really, really hard to make sure that we make bridges and we make connections between, and we give people opportunities and off-ramps to not have to stay siloed in one side or the other,
Right. And that's cool, because that's great, because I remember when I moved to Annapolis, they told me that downtown Annapolis, the businesses used to be all Black. And then at some point, I guess Blacks started, or whites came in and purchased those businesses, and then Blacks were kind of moved into the urban development communities or projects. So, and Annapolis used to be our nation's nation's capital, so being an African American woman and being the first African American woman in the House of Delegates, like, were you aware of that when you came into when you took that seat?
So my understanding and appreciation grows every day. I always meet people that have stories, whether it's their own family story about businesses that they've owned or homes that their family used to own. And then those things were taken away from them. Those things were, enticed away from them, or whatever people's personal journeys are, that really enhance my understanding of how we got to where we are. And it really deepens my desire to make sure that we create opportunities for people, today. So there are folks who will teach me so much about the city that I grew up in, that 39 years isn't enough to know it all, because there are very personal impacts that have happened that you have to just invest the time in getting to know people to get to know. But absolutely, Charles, your understanding of the kind of transition of Annapolis, even just using the downtown area as an example, we had more Black businesses in the 30s and the 40s than we have now. The theme of my party last night was Harlem Renaissance. I wanted to that golden age of Black excellence. And when we had, thought leaders, artists, creatives, business owners, people who had newly emerged and come from the South and come off of plantations, and who were doing wonderful things to just celebrate and create Black culture, the foundations on which you and I stand today,
Right.
that some of that foundation lost its footing when it came to home ownership, when it came to business ownership, that some of those opportunities were clawed back and lost. It really, really motivates me to make sure that we're still pushing for an equitable society.
Does that make you feel like there's a huge weight on your shoulders to make sure that, your constituents get the things that they need?
Makes me feel really grateful that I have an opportunity to make an impact. Because I think that if I didn't have the job, I still would feel a deep desire to want to make the change happen. And so my vehicle to do that would just have to be different.
Right.
And so having the job just means that my vehicle is like faster and stronger.
Right. So also, like, I know you mentioned that, you had a baby in college, right? And that you grew up in Annapolis. Did you grow up in one of the communities that you service now?
I love that question and I love that distinction. So, my growing up, my parents were pastors and they gave me and my sisters a great life. We lived a great middle class life in Annapolis. We got to take vacations in the summer. We got to have the things we needed to, food, clothing, shelter. We got to have a foundation of faith, a love for service and the community. They did a fantastic job. That's how I know one day my son will appreciate his upbringing, because had you asked me that question when I was 17, 18, I had a different answer.
Right.
They were fantastic parents to me and still are to this day. But when I got pregnant with my son in college, my parents said, okay, you're an adult now. You're going to be his mom, and it's your responsibility to provide a life for him, just like we gave to you. So you now have to go and find your way. So when you are halfway through college, no job, no career to speak of, I was just a college student with a handful of credits. And so I moved into one of our subsidized housing communities, one of our public housing communities in Annapolis. And it was a community that I had been to many times with my parents, but I had been there in charity. I had been there to give back, to give out toys for Christmas, backpacks for school, stuff like that. I had never spent extended time, but once I went back to live there with my son, I was a part of the community. Like we were all walking our kids to school together, all talking about our hopes and dreams and goals for the future and what we wanted to do. So it was a humbling experience, because you always have in your mind a concept of how a person finds themselves there. And you always escape it, and you have your different escape hatches and routes, and I'll do this or that different. And so I certainly didn't envision that I would live there one day, but now I'm super grateful that I did, because it gave me so much compassion and humility and understanding of the challenges. So when people say, are you from that community? I draw a distinction, because being from that community is such a different climb out of that community than living there,
Right. And what were some of the eye-opening experiences you had when you moved into that community?
Yeah, I had never understood in great detail the generational nature of people who were in the community, people who had a grandparent that lived in one public housing community, a parent in another, and then they had their own place in one of them, When I think of my support system and what it's meant to me, if I'm in a jam and I needed my parents to help me with resources or connections they have or knowledge they have or time they have, watch my kid while I take an extra class in school to, graduate on time. They had all the abilities in the world to help me. But when your extended network, when your lineage, when your family that's here on earth is also meeting the same challenges and struggles that you are, how that just handicaps your ability to reach out to them for help. I had no concept, no appreciation for how hard that makes it to really climb out and to get to your next destination,
Yeah, and I was interviewing someone the other day, and they brought up the same. Well, we had the same kind of conversation about how there's that generational cycle. We were talking more so about poverty, and they were saying that once they started working with underprivileged youth and kids who come from poverty, that, they were saying that, well, I don't, at first they had the idea that, well, why don't they just go and get a job and work themselves out of that? But then once they started seeing like all of the stuff that happens when they're trying to build themselves up, they have resources that they need, but they can't get to the place to get the resources because they have a shift that they have to work and they need that income in order to provide a success for, in order to provide food and shelter and clothing, things of that nature. Doctor's appointments get missed because, that need to not have to not miss that shift, or the fear of termination and things of that nature. So those points that you made were great. So my question is, like, because I've been to some of those communities that's in Annapolis that we speak, that the public housing communities, and the kids, and my wife is from Annapolis Gardens. She lived in Annapolis Gardens, and she also lived in Robinwood. And I've worked with the students from those communities as well too, and they get exposed to a lot, and my question for you is, when you had to move into, that community, how did you make sure that you stay focused on the goal at hand?
Yeah, I mean, each day was its own challenge, because
Hmm.
like you said, there's always so many things that are present, that are always there, that could be major distractions because there are so many challenges that exist. I think that we now understand that the concept of public housing, as it has been designed by the federal government, of placing hundreds of people that have, these economic challenges, and trapping them in these one way in, one way out communities,
Hmm.
isolated from resources, isolated from other people that could be networks and support system, and putting them all together in this petri dish of underfunded housing that's dilapidated and decaying, that is a flawed concept and a failed model.
Right.
So when you are in the midst of something that is just unworkable, there will always be daily challenges because you are literally in the middle of something that is in breakdown. So
Right.
when it's something that's in breakdown, this piece may fall today and it may be that piece tomorrow. So whether
Mhm.
it's the crime that happens and you have
Right.
witnessed, something horrific that you could never unsee, or whether it's just the despair that happens when you see, someone being mistreated by a partner, or you see some kids not receiving the love that they're going to need to grow up and be whole and be, a sound person. Every day presents its own challenges, its own conflicts. So for me, it was wonderful that I always had the opportunity to be out of the community in
Mhm.
that thing that was my thing, whether it
Mhm.
was driving a cop in state every day, pursuing my degree, if it was going to law school every day. And then,
Mhm.
10 days after I got my first job as an attorney, we turned in our keys and we left. So I always had something that was the thing that I had to get up and go do every day, and it pulled me out of the community. And that's why I'm so focused on giving people opportunities that really take them out of that space, but at the same time, improving that space. Because I know that if you're just there and we don't get you out of there ever, it's going to be
Mhm.
really hard because you're dealing with so much on the daily.
Right. And I'm a school counselor. I work at a middle school up in Pasadena. And also, like I said, I worked at Annapolis High and Hillsborough Elementary. What resources do kids need in the communities of Annapolis that can help get them to a point where they're recognizing those opportunities outside of the community?
Yeah, so the first bill that I filed when I got to the House of Delegates is a bill that I still work on and will continue to work on. It was a bill to make landlords accountable for doing mold remediation. We had a huge problem. We have a huge problem in Annapolis because we have some of the oldest public housing in the entire country.
Wow.
Because of the Naval Academy being here, Annapolis was one of the models for how you build public housing, because originally it was built for families that were coming here to support the Naval Academy. So
Mhm.
that was the federal government's interest in making sure the city had, robust public housing.
Wow, I didn't know
Originally,
that.
public housing was segregated for whites only, originally
Mm.
housing. And then we got housing that was adjacent to the Black community after urban renewal came in. And then, people were enticed out of the homes that they owned into public housing units to live in for rent. And so then we got, the expansion of public housing, which even grew the city's borders. The city of Annapolis proper used to be very small, and then there was the rest of the peninsula, but they annexed in more land from the county and grew the city as those people who were in the city center and owned their properties, like we talked about with the businesses, were pushed into the suburbs and different pockets of, the sprawl of Annapolis. So when we think about the city's housing stock being so old, the needs that exist in there are just tremendous. So one of those challenges has been mold. When we look at the kids and their schooling, one of the challenges that's presented is missed time from school due to asthma attacks. When you think about the indoor air quality and what that does to kids developing chronic lung disease, developing asthma, and all those emergency room visits. The first session that I introduced the bill, we had doctors from Arundel Medical Center emergency room, the children's wing come in and testify about the prevalence of having kids miss time from school due to asthma. So that was one of the things that I said we have to tackle. So in terms of resources, one of the foundational things is simply housing that is safe and habitable to live in. So that bill didn't make it through the first session, didn't make it through the second session, didn't make it through the third session. Continue to introduce it. I know it is good policy, but I know that good policy doesn't always make good politics. So I will continue to swing for that one until powers that be find that it's the right time to move that through. But I also know that in terms of housing being the core issue for me, because I really do believe where you live teaches you how to live, that we have invested a tremendous amount of money into revitalizing the housing stock in the city of Annapolis. We had one community, Newtown 20, now it's called Wilborn Estates, that we were able to totally tear down and rebuild. And that's our plan for each of those communities, one by one, is to go through and fully rebuild each of these communities so that they're safe and habitable.
So where the bill was not making it through, and this is, now are you referring to the bill that was to close the loophole where public housing wasn't inspected like other rental properties? Is that the bill?
So that was my second bill, and thankfully that one did make it through. We had, so the city of Annapolis, as all municipalities do, they have their code enforcement, their building and maintenance standards that says if you're going to build something here, if you're going to have a structure, it could only be this tall, this wide. You have to have your pipes like this. You have to keep it in this condition. You need a smoke detector for this amount of square feet. You need to have a fire extinguisher here. It has all those different standards and specifications. And the city goes through and does code enforcement inspections, every city on a different schedule. For Annapolis, when it's rental housing, they go through once every year or every 2 years, depending on the type of housing you have. Well, they had exempted the city of Annapolis Housing Authority properties from that inspection schedule. They said, we'll have a hands-off policy and we won't those properties. Well, why not? There have their housing held to the same standard as all the housing throughout the entire city. So that was that bill that I passed that said that you have to inspect the properties there and maintain the quality standards at the same level as housing throughout the entire city.
Wow, that's big. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Yes, that's huge because, they should be inspected just as any other rental property. Like, how can you have a hands-off policy?
That's right.
Did that create some of the issues with like the mold and stuff like that too?
So the mold, people had come to me as their older woman and told me that it exists, invited me into their homes. And as I was troubleshooting to figure out how can we hold HACA accountable, how can we, bring more resources, how can we fix this? That's when we discovered that the inspections weren't happening. And so after pushing for them and I got the delegate seat, I finally said, hey, now the push I can have can simply be the mandated. So that's what we were able to do with it. And I'm very proud. The proof of how needed they are is how many violations that exist now that these inspections are happening. It's causing the housing authority to constantly have to clean up their act when it comes to these properties. But that's exactly why the inspections were needed.
So, like, did you celebrate once that bill got passed? Because that's big.
Charles, I appreciate it. I had the residents come in and testify, and Anne Arundel County's House delegation. So all the different delegates that represent a district in Anne Arundel County. We have one of those distinctions where it's a purple county. You have Republican members, you have Democrat members. Unlike most counties like Prince George's or Baltimore City or Montgomery County, where you have, all members of one party, or like, Western Maryland or Eastern Shore County, still all members of one party. And Arundel is one of those few counties that has members from, different sides of the aisle. So when I had the residents from HACA come in and testify about their living conditions, it was a member from the Republican Party who said, let's make a motion to suspend the rules, to have 2 readings on one day, and to move this bill forward to the floor. People were so compelled, people who had no public housing in their district, to do right by these residents because it was obvious that this needed to happen. So it was very gratifying to see that if you can elevate the voices of people, that even people who you may not share, everything in common with, that commonality about keeping people safe, that still existed,
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm glad that got passed because, I think, well, on the outside looking in of politics, you mentioned that other districts have like everyone is a part of one party, so that may make it easier to get a bill passed through. But there's a lot of barriers that come into play when people have different political views. So I definitely appreciate that. Those individuals who may not even had any experience with public housing ended up getting behind you and pushing that bill through because those residents definitely needed that.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. So you also had a bill that in 2021 that provided scholarships to students of historically HBCUs and Maryland law schools. Can you tell me how that came about?
That was wonderful. I got to partner with Senator Corey McCray on that. He was my cross-file in the Senate, so shout out to Senator McCray. I got to work with my HBCU. I graduated from Coppin State University, and my law school. I graduated from University of Baltimore, and we built a collaborative where students who are in undergrad at any of our 4 HBCUs, so whether it's UMES, Bowie State, Coppin State, or Morgan State, where my son is going. If they're so inclined that they want to go to law school, they can enter into a legal scholars program. And in that scholars program, they'll have the opportunity to be mentored by law school professors. So they'll get a heads up about, what classes you should be taking in undergrad to prepare for law school. They'll get opportunities to see what law school curriculum is like. And then when it's time for them to go to law school, they'll have the opportunity for a full ride, tuition-free scholarship to go to law school. So I'm so proud of that. I always say, I don't know anybody who went to law school for free. The smartest person.
Right. Definitely.
He was a basketball standout in high school. He went to undergrad for free. But I don't know anybody who went to law school for free. I forgot how good you play basketball.
Right. So, like, have you met with like school system officials about that to kind of make sure that the awareness is that for those students who are planning to go into law school or into law school at some point after high school?
Yes, the scholar programs at each of the 4 HBCUs, I'm very proud of the work that they're doing to recruit students, to build awareness for it, and to make sure that those opportunities and connections are meaningful. Because once you're in law school, you keep the mentorship. The mentors help you with getting internships, externships. They help you with getting recruited to top law firms so that once you do graduate, you have those opportunities for those, top tier jobs. Because when you are coming from an HBCU, when you are a minority, if you happen to be, because we want everybody to be attracted to our HBCUs, but we know that sometimes the road to getting those, high paying, top tier, big law firm jobs can be harder because it's all about networking and connections. So that's where that mentorship comes in as such a critical component of the collaborative. So I'm really proud of the work that's being done and the scholars that are coming through.
And that's great because it kind of helps to bridge that gap between college graduates or grad school graduates and securing a good paying job, especially coming out of college. I remember when I graduated undergrad, it took a long time for me to actually find a career that could sustain a livable wage, so having that scholarship program and that mentorship and making those connections is definitely going to help a lot of kids kind of build a lifestyle, build a life for themselves and get into the work field much faster than, it typically does. So what led you to want to get into politics? Because you were an attorney first, and then what happened to kind of like make you segue into running for a political office?
Yeah, with my experience living in the public housing community in Annapolis. After I got my job as an attorney and moved out, my son and I, we moved out of Annapolis. We moved further into Arundel County, into a different urban part of the county. One, because Annapolis was really expensive, continues to be. So we had to go to some place that was more transitional and affordable for us at the time. And when I was able to move back to Annapolis, just went to go check on old friends, see how folks had been doing. And I realized that a lot of people hadn't had that same opportunity that I had to transition out of the community, to realize goals and dreams that they had. I got to know and understand how passionate people were about their goals. Just like I wanted to be an attorney, they wanted to, do whatever they were aspiring to, whether it's get a CDL or, go to dental school or whatever it was that they were doing. People wanted to do that, and seeing that those opportunities had been missed and hadn't reached them, I initially started off by looking to see how I could connect people to opportunities. So I started going to city council meetings, civic association meetings, PTA meetings. If there was a meeting, I was dropping in. Where is the power to make this change? Like, where are these threads to connect people? And when I wasn't finding those threads, I decided I think I'll run for office.
Right. And when you ran, did you win your first time?
I did. And I always talk about how a delegate was a position that was there when I first ran for office, but I had never conceived it for myself at that time. My alderman was my former camp director. So he was my camp director when I was 9 years old. And he was my alderman who I had voted and voted back into office. When I came back to Annapolis, I was prepared to vote for him again. And so when I, went to meet with him and he didn't have any solutions for the residents in my community, I said, this isn't okay. Like, you're a really nice guy, but I don't on not having solutions. So
you ran against him.
I did.
And you won.
And I won.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. That's huge because some people would kind of like shy away because this person has been a mentor to them. They've known them since they were an elementary school kid. But you were like, hey, like I appreciate everything you did when I was young, but I'm getting ready to unseat you.
Yeah, it definitely was that type of persistence and bold energy. And he was probably looking at me like, really? But he remains a supporter to this day. So shout out to Kenny Kirby for his time in office and all he did. And when it was my opportunity, and the voters affirmed that, he definitely, stepped aside and was a supporter ever since.
Good. One other thing I want to ask you, is can you talk about the Maryland Sexual Assault Evidence Kit Policy Committee and what that
that's
entails?
deep work. So my first job as an attorney, that job that I got was working for the YWCA, and that provides our domestic violence legal services for Anne Arundel County. So each county has their own legal services provider. Some counties, it's the House of Ruth. Some counties, it's the Community Legal Services Center. For Anne Arundel County, it's the YWCA. So my first job was representing survivors of domestic violence in peace order and protective order hearings. So day in and day out was hearing the needs of people who had experienced domestic violence. Sometimes it was sexual assault, sometimes physical assault, sometimes it was harassment, intimidation, stalking, threatening. Sometimes it was abuse of children that were in the family. You know, whatever that intimate partner violence was, it was my job to make sure that people had the tools they needed to be safe and free from that violence, getting them that peace order, that protective order, securing custody of their children, securing use and possession of the home, the car, all those different assets that you need, because so often it's the economics that keep people in a bad situation. So my job was to do that. So when I went into the House of Delegates the year before I got there, they passed a bill because our sexual assault testing center, our labs, they had this huge backlog where when people were victims of sexual assault, the rape kits that would go for testing at the state lab, they were on a backlog of testing the rape kits to get the DNA evidence processed and to send that information to our prosecutors. So because of the backlog, these cases were delayed in their prosecution. So if you are a victim and you're thinking about, you know, coming to court for repeated postponement requests, not being able to close that wound and really move forward with your life because you haven't had your day in court, having to remember the facts with complete accuracy and withstand cross-examination simply because the state laboratory is holding back these results and your justice process can't move forward. So in 2018, just before I got there, that said that this is the time frame in which you have to move forward with the testing kits. We're going to provide additional funding, but that additional funding is going to be tied to your performance. Wow. We're going to have an oversight committee that makes sure you are processing the rape kits and you are getting this information to the prosecutors. So the Speaker Adrienne Jones, she appointed me to that oversight committee. So we get together quarterly and we make sure that our state lab is meeting those benchmarks, is processing the test kits, and is getting that information into the hands of our prosecutors.
Good. Because that can be take a huge toll on the individual, you know, not only having to have their justice delayed and having to face, you know, that individual in court, but also if that individual isn't being prosecuted, they may still be having to be in contact with that individual too, and continue to have that to relive, you know, all of that instead of, you know, being able to have that person prosecuted and move past it. So that's great work that you're doing. And I greatly appreciate it.
That's an excellent point.
So one last question. What do you look for in your journey in your career of political office? What do you look for in the future?
So in terms of how I measure progress, change is how I measure progress. You know, when I walked into the newly built community was Newtown 20, it's now Wilbourn Estates. Seeing what was the worst of our existing public housing communities now be a brand new community. To me, that meant, you know, we're doing something right. We're on the right road here. When I go into my old elementary school, Tyler Heights Elementary School, which at one point was at 110% state rated capacity. They had one trailer that was only bathrooms because there were not even enough bathrooms for the kids in the school. Wow. I said, this is basically an outhouse that we're sending our kids out in the cold and the snow. One little girl talked about being on crutches because she had an ankle injury and having to get out to the bathroom trailer and was worried about wetting her pants before she got out there in the snow to go use the bathroom because there weren't enough bathrooms available in the school building for the number of children. And now that building is a brand new building with enough space for all the kids and the resources that they need. So when at things that have changed, for me, that is a measure of we are on the right road. We are doing the right things here, you know? So that's change. When I look to the future and some of the things that I want to accomplish and do, I have some specifics. Some of the things that I've worked on that I want to come back to and revisit are some of those things that increase wages for some of our low wage workers. I had a bill that would take the profession of home health care aides. When we looked at the top 3 professions in our public housing communities, number 2 was people who work in the healthcare field. So this is obviously not your doctors, your nurses. These are the people who are all the way at the unskilled end of the profession, but who are providing critical care to people. And so we have done things to raise rates for the providers to make sure that the companies have more money, but the workers who are making sure people can age in place and live in their homes with dignity, those workers that are providing that hands-on care for people, their wages have remained flat. And it's one of the reasons why so many of them need government assistance for housing and daily needs. So I want to make sure I revisit the bill like that to increase their wages so that they can get the benefits of some of the investments we've made as a government. I want to revisit bills that make sure we have opportunities in our workplaces, opportunities in our communities as well. So I have a handful of things I want to look into. Public safety is, of course, very important. We have the opioid restitution fund. What we've done with the Sackler family and holding them accountable for the oxycodone that's come onto our streets and OxyContin and really just crippled, in my opinion, a generation of people, you know, how it just so pervasive with the deaths and the overdoses. We now have some resources on the back end, and we'll have a tremendous opportunity to program that money. Well, I see a direct connection between the prescription drug, crisis and what we've seen in the illegal drug market as well, because we know all of those prescription drugs, they don't always just get dispensed at a pharmacy. Sometimes they get on the street. Sure that money finds its way to those communities that suffer from the illegal drug trade as well. So I have some ideas around how we can do that to make sure that mental health resources are brought to these communities, because it's a tremendous load to bear when your neighborhood is the neighborhood that everybody rides through to get their drugs. And let's be clear, it's everybody that's riding.
Right.
Who live there. So I want to make sure they get the opportunity to benefit from some of these things we fought really hard for. So I definitely have plans for the upcoming session. If I'm blessed with another opportunity, I definitely don't want to waste it.
Right. So will we see Ms. Shaneka Henson running for a U.S. representative office or a senator in the future?
Oh my gosh. I felt like when I got into city council, I had no idea, no concept that opportunity for being in the House of Delegates would open and be available to me. Being the first Black woman to hold this seat, I guess I hadn't seen myself for it because I hadn't seen anybody like me in it, and so when I look at other opportunities that are out there, I have learned to not put limits on myself now. But I certainly haven't made a roadmap that takes me anywhere else, because I am still just, squeezing all the opportunities out of this one that exists for the folks I came here to represent.
Great. And we greatly appreciate everything that you're doing and have done. And we talk about conquering mountains, and you are definitely leading the charge and fighting for your constituents and the people of the city of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. And I greatly appreciate all the things that you have done. I was in awe as I began to research you and look at all of the things that you have done, the bills that you have passed. You're a very inspiring and influential individual. And I'm so glad that, you are continuing to work and fight for your constituents. So I greatly appreciate everything that you're doing and will do.
Thank you for this platform, Charles, for helping people remember that, there are mountains, but you can conquer them.
Absolutely.
So much of media just echoes the challenges that exist, but it doesn't make that next step in telling people that there are pathways and opportunities and uplifting people like yourself who have overcome challenges, so that folks are inspired and motivated to overcome their own challenges. So thank you for opening a space of positivity where people can go to and reflect on and build their strength to conquer their own challenges.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That is very inspiring. Hang on for a second as I stop the recording.